A film I caught up with on Amazon recently was Lucy and Desi, a documentary directed by Amy Poehler about the life and relationship of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, who were the leading comedy team of the 1950s in American television. I Love Lucy, their sitcom, was massively successful, and their various innovations allowed them to create a studio, Desi Productions, which during the 60s was a major force in television. In 1966 alone, it launched both Star Trek and Mission Impossible. The film is a biography of the two from their first meeting up until their deaths. Um, but although the film is drawn heavily on audio recordings and original interviews with Ball and Arnaz and new interviews with many colleagues and family members, it still feels sloppy. Arnaz's vices are quite reasonably called out, but Ball is almost sanctified. It's very much a hagiography of her, and my patience with the film was most severely tested when I found that it repeated the ridiculous lie from the Aaron Sorkin film, being the Ricardos, that when it was suspected that Ball was a communist, because she'd given her political affiliation as communist years earlier to placate her socialist grandfather, um, that Arnaz arranged for J. Edgar Hoover, the notoriously far-right director of the FBI, to call into the I Love Lucy set in front of the audience and exonerate her with a live crowd. That obviously didn't happen. Something that absurd should never have passed through any kind of documentary fact checking. But the film here places it as a matter of fact, which makes it extremely hard to take the rest of it seriously, regardless of how conventionally it's presented. If you're going to be that sloppy with your fact checking, I really don't see why I should take the rest of the film seriously. So it provided an immediate, huge roadblock to appreciating the rest of the film. For the most part, it's a very conventional, straightforward documentary. There's a bit of visual style in terms of compositing old photographs and old footage. The use of interviews with friends and colleagues is very well done, and the chronological um, progression and diversions is quite cleanly worked out. Again, there seems to be, as with um, the Sorkin film, a not a conflation, but certainly a confusion between the two Cuban revolutions, the one in the 1930s that installed a military dictatorship under Batista, and then the communist revolution in the early 60s, which actually took place after the Lucy show had been on air for a number of years, and supposedly the reason why Arnaz and his family had to leave Cuba, which is obviously untrue. They had to flee because Arnaz's family were involved in politics and left because of the communist coup, which was backed by the US government. This kind of sloppy documentary making can work in terms of telling an overall story. Werner Herzog gets away with it because he's seeking a greater truth, as he says it. But here, it's a matter of interviews. It's a matter of stating facts. It's a very conventional film. It's not the kind of more flamboyant storytelling exercise you get in more experienced hands. And as a result, my opinion of this film is quite low. You shouldn't watch it if you want facts because it trots out at least one old saw that's demonstrably untrue. Um, and if you can't trust a documentary for adhering to the facts, or at least bending the facts to tell a greater truth, then there's no point to it at all. So there's really no point to this film.